It all started on a warm spring morning when I noticed something strange happening outside my house. I live on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a place where most of the residents keep to themselves, and I liked it that way. My property sits on a corner lot, which means I have a long driveway that stretches from one street entrance to the other, almost like a private road. I bought this house because of that driveway. I like my privacy. I like having the space to park my truck, my trailer, and sometimes my buddy's boat when he needs a place to keep it for the weekend. The driveway was mine, legally and fully, not shared with anyone. At least, that's what I thought when I signed the papers and paid for the house with my hard-earned money. But as anyone who has ever had the misfortune of dealing with a homeowners association knows, just because something is yours doesn't mean other people won't try to get their hands on it. For months after moving in, I kept a low profile, paid my dues, followed the rules, and stayed out of trouble. I didn't plant anything the HOA didn't approve of, didn't paint my house an off color, didn't make loud noise, didn't leave my trash cans out for more than a day. I was the model neighbor, and for a while, I thought that would be enough to stay under the radar. But then came the morning I saw the first car cut through my driveway, and everything changed. At first, I thought it was an honest mistake. The car, a silver sedan, turned into my driveway from the east entrance, drove across slowly, and turned out the west side, like my property was a shortcut between the two streets. I was drinking coffee on my porch when it happened, and I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were avoiding a delivery truck blocking the main road. It didn't bother me that time. But the next morning, another car did it. Then another. By the end of the week, I had seen at least a dozen cars using my driveway as their own personal road, some of them driving way too fast for comfort. It didn't take long for me to notice that one of the regular offenders was a shiny black BMW with custom plates and tinted windows. I recognized it from the HOA meetings. That car belonged to Susan Miller, the HOA president herself. She was the type of person who walked into every meeting like she owned the whole neighborhood, always talking about community standards and protecting property values. She was also the type of person who handed out violations for the smallest infractions, like leaving your Christmas lights up a day too long or not power washing your fence in spring. To see her of all people using my driveway like it was public property really got under my skin. At first, I tried to be patient. I figured if it was a one-off thing, it wasn't worth making a big deal about. But within a couple of weeks, the number of cars cutting through had doubled, maybe tripled. There were mornings when I counted 6 or 7 in the span of half an hour. I started noticing tire marks in the gravel where some of them accelerated too fast, kicking up dust and rocks. I noticed my mailbox had been clipped slightly, like someone had cut the turn too sharp one night. And the worst part was, they were starting to get bolder. One SUV nearly hit my dog when I let him out one afternoon, and that was when I decided enough was enough. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was dangerous. People were using my property without permission, putting me, my pets, and my property at risk. The first thing I did was try to be polite. I went to the next HOA meeting, waited until the open forum section, and calmly brought up what I was seeing. I explained that cars were using my driveway as a cut-through, that I didn't like it, and that I wanted it to stop. I even showed them pictures from my security camera footage, which clearly showed Susan's BMW among the cars driving through. I wasn't aggressive about it. I wasn't yelling or threatening anyone. I just asked that people respect my property. Susan smiled that fake, tight-lipped smile she was famous for and said she would look into it. That was all she said. No apology. No promise to send out a community email reminding residents not to trespass. just that she would look into it. I left that meeting hoping that maybe she really would take care of it. Maybe this would all be resolved peacefully. But I should have known better. The very next morning, Susan's BMW flew through my driveway again, this time faster than before. And this time she wasn't alone. 2 more cars followed behind her, like a little convoy. It was like she had gone out of her way to make sure I knew she wasn't going to stop. That's when I realized this wasn't just about convenience for her. This was about power. Susan was daring me to do something about it. She was showing me that she didn't think I could stop her. That lit a fire under me. I wasn't about to let someone bully me on my own property, least of all someone who had no problem sending me letters about how my trash bins needed to be brought in by 8 a.m. sharp. So I started documenting everything. Every car that came through, I wrote down the time, the make, the model, the license plate number if I could catch it. I installed a better camera at the end of the driveway so I could get clearer footage. After 2 weeks, I had hours of video showing car after car using my driveway as a road. I put together a binder with printouts of still images from the video, each one labeled with the date and time. I even took a picture of the skid mark left behind by the SUV that nearly hit my dog. When I had my evidence ready, I sent an official letter to the HOA board demanding action, citing trespassing laws and my property rights. I thought surely with this much proof, they would have to act. When their response came, it wasn't what I expected. The letter, signed by Susan herself, stated that my driveway served a practical purpose for neighborhood traffic flow, and that restricting access could negatively impact community convenience and safety. They actually suggested I keep it open to maintain harmony among residents. Harmony? Was she kidding? They were telling me to let strangers drive across my property every day like it was a public road, and I was just supposed to smile and take it? That was the moment I knew I wasn't going to get any help from the HOA. If anything, they were encouraging the problem. That's when I decided I was going to handle this myself, one way or another. Perfect, let's continue with paragraph 2, 4,000 words, of your story. After receiving that ridiculous letter from the HOA, I knew I had to play this smart. I wasn't going to run out there screaming at every car that passed through. That would just make me look like the neighborhood lunatic, and that's exactly what Susan would want. No, if I was going to put a stop to this, I had to do it in a way that was undeniable, permanent, and above all, completely legal. I wasn't looking for drama, I wasn't looking to start a war, but I wasn't about to let anyone walk all over me either. This was my property, my driveway, and if I didn't stand my ground now, I'd be dealing with this forever. So I started with research. I spent a couple of late nights combing through county property records, HOA bylaws, and local ordinances. I confirmed what I already knew, my driveway was entirely on my property. There was no easement, no right-of-way, no legal precedent for anyone to use it except me. I even called the county office to double-check, and they assured me that as long as I wasn't blocking a public utility, I had every right to restrict access. That was all I needed to hear. If Susan wanted to play hardball, I was ready to play too. The next step was figuring out the best way to block access without getting myself in trouble. I thought about putting up a fence, but the HOA had strict rules about fencing, and I didn't want to give them a reason to fine me. I considered installing a gate, but that would be expensive and take weeks to get approved by the county. Then it hit me, boulders. Big, heavy landscaping boulders that could sit at the end of the driveway like silent guardians, impossible to drive around or move without heavy machinery. There was nothing in the HOA rules about decorative rocks, and landscaping was well within my rights as a homeowner. I got on the phone with a local landscaping supplier and ordered 2 massive granite boulders, each weighing close to a ton. They were delivered 2 days later, dropped neatly onto my property near the entrance to the driveway. I spent the better part of a Saturday arranging them just right, one at each end of the driveway, far enough apart that I could still pull my truck through but narrow enough that no one could cut across without risking their paint job. When I was done, I stepped back and admired my work. They looked natural, like they had always been there, but they sent a clear message: this is private property. The first few days after placing the boulders were glorious. For the first time in weeks, no one drove through my driveway except me. I could sit on my porch with my coffee in peace, watching the sun rise without a parade of cars cutting through like it was some kind of shortcut to their morning commute. My dog could run around without me worrying about him getting run over. The gravel stayed where it was supposed to instead of being kicked up into clouds of dust. It felt like I had taken back control, and I was proud of myself for finding a solution that was both clever and legal. But I should have known Susan wouldn't let it go that easily. About a week later, I got a notice in the mail. It was an official violation from the HOA stating that my landscaping elements were obstructing community access and needed to be removed within 10 days. They even threatened to fine me $100 per day if I didn't comply. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. Obstructing community access? What access? This was my property. There was no road easement, no community right-of-way, nothing that gave them any legal claim to my driveway. They were just making things up now, hoping I'd cave under the pressure. But I wasn't about to back down. I wrote them a letter back, citing the exact property laws that proved I was in the right. I included a copy of my property survey, which clearly showed the driveway was entirely mine, and I told them if they continued to harass me, I would be forced to take legal action for trespassing and harassment. That must have really made Susan mad because the very next morning, I caught her standing at the end of my driveway, staring at the boulders with her arms crossed. She didn't see me at first, and I just stood there quietly, watching her. She looked furious, muttering under her breath, probably rehearsing whatever speech she was planning to give me. When she finally noticed me, she tried to act friendly, giving me that fake HOA President smile again, but I could see the anger behind it. She told me that what I had done was unneighborly and against the spirit of the community. I calmly reminded her that my property was not a public road and that if she wanted to discuss it further, she could have her lawyer contact me. That must have struck a nerve because she stormed off without another word, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement. I thought that might be the end of it, but of course, with someone like Susan, it never is. The following week, I started noticing something strange. It wasn't just cars that were coming near my driveway anymore. People were walking by slowly, stopping to take pictures, and even measuring the distance between the boulders with tape measures. It was obvious Susan was trying to build some kind of case against me, maybe to take to the HOA board or even to court. Fine by me. If she wanted a fight, I was ready for one. I doubled down on my preparations, installing a second set of security cameras at different angles so I could capture every possible view. I even had a lawyer friend of mine draft a cease and desist letter just in case things escalated. Then came the day that turned this from a petty neighborhood squabble into an all-out war. I was at work when I got a motion alert from my security system. When I checked the live feed on my phone, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Susan's BMW was parked halfway up my driveway, and there was a man with a reflective vest standing next to it, looking at my boulders like he was inspecting them. I left work early and drove home as fast as I could. By the time I got there, they were gone, but there was a bright orange stake in the ground near one of the boulders, like someone had tried to mark it for removal. That was the final straw. They were trespassing on my property, trying to intimidate me, and possibly even planning to move the boulders without my permission. I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. That night, I moved both boulders closer together, narrowing the opening so only my truck could squeeze through. I also added a couple of thick steel chains between them, just to make sure no one could get any ideas about pushing them aside. It took me hours, working under the glow of my floodlights, but by the time I was done, I knew there was no way anyone was getting through without my say-so. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of honking. When I stepped outside, there it was, Susan's BMW, stuck in front of the boulders, blocking the entire street. She had tried to cut through again and realized too late that there was no way to get around. She sat there, honking her horn like that was going to make me come out and move the rocks for her. I just stood on my porch with my coffee, watching her fume. Eventually, she had to back up and drive all the way around the block like everyone else. That was the most satisfying cup of coffee I've ever had in my life. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Alright, let's continue with paragraph 3, 4,000 words, of your story. The morning Susan's BMW was forced to back out of my driveway was a turning point. I knew from the look on her face that she wasn't going to just accept defeat. People like Susan don't back down quietly, they regroup, they plot, and they come back twice as hard. Sure enough, by the end of that week, the first salvo of retaliation arrived in my mailbox, a stack of HOA violation notices thicker than a phone book. They were citing me for everything from unauthorized landscaping to obstructing community access, and they even had the audacity to throw in a violation for failure to maintain a harmonious exterior aesthetic. That one really made me laugh. My lawn was trimmed, my house freshly painted, my property cleaner than half the homes in the neighborhood, and they were trying to say I wasn't harmonious because I had rocks in my driveway? It was ridiculous, but it was also a tactic. Susan wanted to bury me in fines and paperwork until I either gave up or moved out. I wasn't about to do either. I contacted my lawyer friend again and had him draft a formal response disputing every single violation. I attached photos of my perfectly manicured yard, receipts for the landscaping rocks, and copies of the county property records proving my legal right to place them. I sent it certified mail so they couldn't claim they didn't receive it. At the same time, I started quietly gathering allies. You'd be surprised how many neighbors dislike the HOA but stay quiet because they're afraid of getting on the wrong side of people like Susan. I started talking to them, casually at first, while mowing the lawn, while walking the dog, at the mailbox. And little by little, I learned that I wasn't the only one who had issues with her. She'd fined one neighbor for having a pickup truck in his driveway overnight, even though he used it for work. She'd forced another to repaint her shutters because the color clashed with the rest of the street. She'd even sent a letter to an elderly couple demanding they replace their mailbox because it wasn't modern enough. Everyone had a story, and they were tired of it. That gave me an idea. If Susan wanted a war, I wasn't going to fight it alone. I organized an informal gathering at my house one Saturday afternoon. I invited every neighbor I knew had a problem with the HOA, and to my surprise, nearly a dozen people showed up. We sat around my backyard fire pit sharing stories, comparing letters, and passing around copies of HOA rules. By the end of the evening, we had formed a little alliance. We agreed to attend the next HOA meeting together, as a group, and confront Susan about her abuse of power. It was risky. I knew she would try to shut us down, but it was time someone stood up to her. When the day of the meeting came, I was ready. I walked in with my binder of evidence under my arm, my neighbors flanking me like a small army. Susan was sitting at the head of the table, looking smug as ever, but when she saw the group I had brought, her smile faltered just a bit. The meeting started the way they always do, with boring announcements and budget discussions, but when the floor opened for community concerns, I stood up first. I laid out everything: the trespassing, the boulders, the threats of fines, the harassment. I showed them the footage of her BMW driving through my driveway. I showed them the property map. I showed them the letter from the county confirming there was no easement. And then one by one, my neighbors stood up and shared their stories too. It was like a tidal wave. You could see the other board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the list of grievances grew longer and longer. Susan tried to keep control, banging her little gavel and saying we were out of order, but by then the room was firmly on our side. One neighbor even called for a vote to censure the HOA president for abuse of power. Susan's face turned beet red. She tried to argue, tried to twist the rules, but the board couldn't ignore the sheer number of people speaking out. By the end of the night, they voted to table all fines against me until further review. It wasn't a total victory, but it was a huge step in the right direction. More importantly, it showed Susan that I wasn't alone anymore. Of course, that only made her angrier. The very next day, she parked her BMW directly in front of my driveway, blocking me from getting out. She left it there for nearly an hour while I stood on my porch recording everything. When I finally called the police, she tried to claim that she had every right to park there since it was a public street. The officer who showed up wasn't impressed. He made her move the car and warned her that if she did it again, it would be considered harassment. I could see the fury in her eyes as she drove off. She wasn't used to losing, and now she was losing in front of the whole neighborhood. That was when I decided to make my next move. Blocking my driveway was one thing, but trying to intimidate me after the whole neighborhood had already sided with me? That called for something a little more dramatic. I hired a contractor to pour a fresh layer of gravel over the driveway, making it look even more private and clearly marked. I had them add 2 sturdy wooden posts with a heavy-duty chain between them that I could unlock when I wanted to get in or out. It looked nice, clean, and professional, and most importantly, it was completely within my rights. The day it was finished, I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. There was no way anyone could drive through now, not without causing serious damage to their car. A few days later, Susan came storming up to my porch, demanding I remove the posts. I stayed calm, told her she was trespassing, and asked her to leave my property. When she refused, I simply held up my phone and told her she was being recorded. She finally turned on her heel and stormed off, shouting something about taking me to court. Fine by me. If she wanted a legal battle, I was ready for it. I had evidence, I had witnesses, and I had the law on my side. The funny thing was, after that, the number of cars trying to cut through dropped to almost zero. Word must have spread quickly that I wasn't messing around. People started avoiding my driveway altogether, and for the first time in months, I felt a real sense of peace. I could sit on my porch again, watching the world go by, knowing no one was going to come barreling through uninvited. Susan still drove by every now and then, glaring at me as she passed, but she never tried to use the driveway again. I thought maybe, just maybe, things were finally calming down. But I was wrong. This battle wasn't finished. Susan still had one last card to play, and she was about to make her biggest move yet. Alright, let's move on with paragraph 4,000 words, of your story. I didn't have to wait long to see what Susan's next move would be. Just 2 weeks after our tense exchange on my porch, I received a letter that was far more official looking than the usual HOA mail. It was from a law firm the HOA had retained, claiming that my boulders, chains, and posts created a hazard and restricted emergency vehicle access. They demanded I remove all obstructions within 10 days or face a lawsuit. Now, I had expected some kind of legal threat eventually, but the part about emergency vehicles made my blood boil. My driveway wasn't even on any emergency route. I confirmed this with the fire department months earlier, and there were 2 other perfectly good streets that emergency vehicles could use to reach every house in the neighborhood. This wasn't about safety, it was about Susan throwing around HOA funds to bully me through her lawyer. Instead of panicking, I got strategic. I called my lawyer friend and showed him the letter. He laughed when he read it and said we had a solid case if they actually tried to take me to court. He even offered to represent me at a discounted rate because he loved seeing HOA bullies get knocked down a peg. That gave me the confidence to go on the offensive. I wrote back to the law firm, attaching a detailed report I'd obtained from the fire marshal stating that my driveway was not, and had never been, part of any emergency access route. I also included photos showing the boulders were placed fully on my property and left adequate space for my own vehicle to enter and exit safely. Finally, I added a statement that any further attempts to trespass or interfere with my property would result in a lawsuit, not from them against me, but from me against them. When Susan got that response, she must have been livid. I could practically feel the heat of her glare from across the neighborhood whenever I stepped outside. And then, one evening, just after sunset, I caught her making her boldest move yet. My security camera pinged, and when I pulled up the live feed on my phone, I saw a tow truck idling near my driveway. The driver was out of the truck, talking to Susan, pointing at the boulders like he was getting ready to move them. I didn't waste a second. I walked straight outside, phone in hand, recording everything. I told the tow truck driver that he was about to trespass on private property and that if he touched anything, I'd be calling the police. The driver looked nervous, clearly he hadn't been told the full story, and after a few tense seconds, he got back in his truck and drove away. Susan stood there seething, calling me unreasonable and saying I was endangering the community. I just told her to leave my property before I called the cops. This time, I wasn't bluffing, and she knew it. She stormed off into the night, her heels stabbing the pavement like tiny gunshots. That was the moment I realized Susan wasn't just a control freak, she was obsessed. No rational person would go this far over a driveway. It wasn't about the shortcut anymore, it was about her ego. She couldn't stand that I had told her no, and that I had gotten the neighborhood on my side. And honestly, part of me started to enjoy watching her unravel. She was used to being the queen bee, and now she was being forced to back down. But I also knew I had to finish this once and for all. As long as she was HOA president, she'd keep coming after me. So I started preparing for the nuclear option, removing her from office. The HOA bylaws spelled out a process for removing a board member through a community vote. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. I circulated a petition around the neighborhood, explaining everything Susan had done, the trespassing, the harassment, the legal threats, even the attempted boulder removal. My neighbors were more than happy to sign. Many of them had been waiting for someone to stand up to her for years, and I had given them a reason to believe it was possible. By the time I was done, I had well over the number of signatures required to call for a special election. I submitted the petition to the HOA board and requested a meeting date. When Susan found out, she completely lost it. She came to my house again, screaming this time, accusing me of turning the whole neighborhood against her. I didn't even bother engaging, I just stood there, calm and collected, recording the whole meltdown. It was pure gold. By the end of her rant, she was threatening to sue me personally, to sue my lawyer, to sue anyone who signed the petition. When she finally stormed off, I sent the video to the rest of the board members and to several of my neighbors. By the time the special meeting came around, Susan's reputation was in shreds. The meeting that night was packed. More people showed up than I had ever seen at an HOA meeting before. The tension in the room was electric as the board chair called the meeting to order. Susan tried to defend herself, claiming I had waged a personal vendetta against her, but no one was buying it. I stood up, calmly presented my evidence, and played the video of her screaming on my porch. That was the nail in the coffin. The board called for a vote, and the majority voted to remove her as HOA President effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. Susan grabbed her purse, stormed out, and I swear I could almost hear the sound of her pride shattering as she drove away for the last time. After that night, everything changed. The new HOA board was far more reasonable. They rescinded all fines against me, sent out a community-wide reminder about respecting private property, and even apologized for the way things had been handled. My driveway was no longer a shortcut, it was just my driveway, the way it was always meant to be. And as for Susan, she put her house up for sale a few months later and moved out of the neighborhood entirely. The day I saw the moving truck pull away was one of the most satisfying days of my life. But I wasn't done celebrating yet. I decided to throw a neighborhood cookout as a kind of victory party. I invited everyone, even the people who had stayed neutral during the feud. We grilled burgers, played music, and laughed about the whole saga. Someone even made a joke about painting Susan's old parking spot on my driveway just to commemorate the battle. By the end of the night, I realized something. This whole ordeal, as stressful as it had been, had actually brought the neighborhood closer together. People were friendlier, more willing to talk to each other, and more willing to stand up to the HOA when they felt wronged. And every time I walked past those two massive boulders at the end of my driveway, I couldn't help but smile. They weren't just rocks, they were a monument to standing up for myself, a reminder that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to outstubborn them. Great, let's finish strong with paragraph 5, final 4,000 words, of your story. Life after Susan felt completely different, almost like the whole neighborhood had taken a deep breath and finally exhaled. For the first time since I had moved in, things felt normal. Peaceful. My mornings went back to being quiet. No cars tearing through my driveway. No angry notices in my mailbox. No HOA president lurking around, waiting to pounce on some imaginary violation. Instead, I woke up to birdsong, brewed my coffee, sat on the porch, and watched my dog trot happily across the yard, free from the danger of speeding SUVs. The sense of relief was immense, but even more than relief, I felt proud that I hadn't rolled over, proud that I had fought back in a way that was legal, smart, and fair. And maybe most importantly, proud that I had shown my neighbors it was possible to stand up to someone abusing their power. Over the next few months, the neighborhood kept changing in small but noticeable ways. The new HOA board, led by a reasonable guy named Tom who actually listened to people, made several improvements. They cut down on unnecessary fines, stopped nitpicking every little thing, and started focusing on real issues like maintaining the park and repairing the sidewalks. Homeowners started showing up to meetings again, not because they were afraid of being targeted, but because they genuinely wanted to have a say in what was happening. People began helping each other out more, too. I saw neighbors lending tools, offering to mow lawns for the elderly couple down the street, even organizing a community yard sale. It felt like the neighborhood was finally becoming a place worth living in, not just some subdivision policed by a power-hungry board. One of my favorite moments came about a month after Susan left. A new family moved into her old house, a young couple with 2 kids and a friendly Labrador who immediately became buddies with my dog. On moving day, I walked over, introduced myself, and told them the story of the shortcut driveway, just to give them a little neighborhood history. They laughed, shook their heads, and told me they couldn't believe someone would go to war over something so petty. I just smiled and told them that around here, things had changed for the better. I didn't mention Susan by name, no point in keeping her ghost alive, but I did tell them that the boulders at the end of my driveway weren't just landscaping. They were a symbol of boundaries, literally and figuratively. The husband laughed and said, "I like that. Standing your ground." We shook hands, and right then, I knew these were the kind of neighbors who belonged here. Of course, I wasn't naive enough to think everything would always be perfect. HOAs have a way of creeping back toward micromanagement if you don't keep them in check, but this time I was ready. I kept my binder of evidence, all my documents, all my camera footage, not because I expected another fight, but because I wasn't about to let history repeat itself. I also volunteered to serve on the HOA board myself, not as president but as a regular member. I figured if I wanted things to stay fair, I had to be willing to help make that happen. Surprisingly, the neighborhood voted me in without hesitation. Some of them even said they trusted me more than anyone else because I had already proven I was willing to stand up for property rights. Serving on the board was an education. I got to see firsthand how decisions were made, how budgets were allocated, how disputes were handled. It made me realize just how much damage Susan had done by running things like a dictator. She hadn't been representing the community, she had been using the HOA as her personal tool to control everyone. With her gone, things ran much smoother, and it felt good to be part of the solution instead of the problem. There were still occasional disagreements, sure, but now we actually talked them out like adults instead of slapping people with fines and letters. And funny enough, some of the people who had been afraid to even speak to me when I first moved in started coming to me for advice. It was like I had gone from being that guy with the boulders to being someone they trusted to look out for their interests. One evening, a few months later, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when my neighbor Jeff walked over with a couple of beers. He sat down next to me and said, "You know, you might have saved this neighborhood." I laughed and told him that was a bit dramatic, but he shook his head. "No, seriously. People were miserable before. Everyone was just waiting for the next letter, the next fine. We were scared to breathe wrong. Now it feels like we actually live here, not like we're tenants in someone else's kingdom." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just clinked my bottle against his and said, "Well, here's to keeping it that way." We sat there in comfortable silence, listening to the crickets and watching the last light fade behind the boulders that had started it all. Looking back, the whole ordeal taught me a lot more than just how to stand up to an HOA president. It taught me that boundaries matter, physical ones, yes, but also personal ones. It taught me that bullies only have as much power as you let them have. And it taught me that a single person can make a difference if they're willing to take a stand, even if that means being the bad guy for a little while. Those 2 boulders at the end of my driveway aren't just landscaping anymore, they're a reminder that I didn't back down, that I defended what was mine, and that in the end, the whole neighborhood was better for it. Sometimes I still catch myself glancing at the security cameras out of habit, half expecting to see a black BMW creeping up my driveway again. But it never happens. Those days are gone, and honestly, I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. It was stressful, sure, but it was also empowering. I went from being just another homeowner to someone who actually had a say in what happened in my community. And maybe that's the real victory, not just blocking a car, not just winning a feud, but turning a petty fight over a driveway into something that made the entire neighborhood stronger. So now, whenever I sit out there on a quiet evening with a cold drink in hand, watching the sun dip behind those granite giants, I smile to myself. The fight is over, the war is won, and my driveway, my property, belongs to me again. And if anyone ever tries to turn it into a shortcut again, well, they'd better be ready to face 2 tons of stone and one very determined homeowner.